Thanks very much, Troy. Nice to see you all. What a lineup of parishes. So I'm going to be around for the morning, so I hope to meet, if not everyone, at least most of you, before I hasten off into the future. But I've been given the task at the start of the day of speaking on the theme, leading through listening, led by the Spirit. Every word in that is a bomb. So let me not defuse the bomb, but let it explode creatively through the next 40 or so minutes. Let me turn first to leadership, leading. I mean, everyone calls me a church leader. That's true, I suppose. But the danger is of thinking that I, or perhaps Sister Monica, who is the congregational leader of the Sisters of St. Joseph, that we are the leaders and you are the led. Well, I'm sorry, that's not the case, because you are baptised. I presume you are. You look like it. And if you're baptised, then you're a leader in one way or another. And the very fact that you're here at this gathering this morning says that you are a leader. Now, you mightn't think of yourself in those terms. All right, you're not the Archbishop and you're not the congregational leader. You're not even the parish priest. But the question is, in what way are you being called to leadership? Because that's the first thing I would say about Christian leadership. Just by the way, Christian leadership in many ways resembles leadership of any kind. There's a serious overlap between leadership in the church and any other kind of effective leadership in any other area of human activity. But there are certain things about Christian leadership which are completely distinctive, and it might pay us to focus upon one or two of them as I reflect in the next few minutes. I've said you're called, and that's the first thing. I chose you, you didn't choose me. Here I quote the words of the Lord himself. So that the very fact of you being here now says that in some ways you are being called to lead. And the only question is, in what way are you being called? What kind of leadership are you being called to exercise? Now, leadership has always been a tough gig. But I think it's particularly tough at the moment. And I'm not here crying, poor me. I'm just stating the fact that we live in a time of very considerable and ongoing flux. The patterns are not settled. So leadership for us can't be simply doing what has always been done. In many cultures and societies around the world in the past and even now, that is the essence of leadership, making sure that we do what has always been done. Now, I know that we as a church, the Catholic Church, we make a lot of fuss, and rightly so, about tradition, as we call it, sometimes giving it a great big capital T. In other words, we have that sense that there is an authoritative tradition which communicates to us the Word of God. It's one of the ways in which God communicates with us. And that's why we call it an authoritative tradition, because the authority in the end rests with God. Now, the danger can be, therefore, because we speak of an authoritative tradition, to think that that's what leadership is all about. And there are some in the church who see it like that it's standing guard over that which we have received, defending the faith or safeguarding the deposit of faith, sometimes is the expression used. Now, there's truth in all of that, but again, we've got to deal with the facts on the ground. And God help us if we have leaders who do not live in the real world and do not deal with the facts on the ground. In a sense, I think that's all Pope Francis is saying. Could we please deal with the facts on the ground and not live in some idealised world of what ought to be, but live in the real world of real human beings, deal with what is. Pastoral planning, it's an ambivalent phrase, but if it's going to have any real effect, it's got to be attuned to two things. The facts on the ground, and they're harder to identify than you think. Not as they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but as they are now in a time of massive and permanent change. And the second thing that any planning in the church has to deal with is the grace of the moment. And that can be harder to identify than we think too. What is God calling us to? And hence the importance of listening, more of which in a moment. But one fact we're dealing with is that for most people, and certainly for anyone who's young, simply to appeal to an authoritative tradition does not cut the ice. You've got to show, not just in your words, but in the way you live, that authoritative tradition leads genuinely to human flourishing, and human flourishing not just for some, but for all. Now, very often, I'm afraid, in the church, when we talk of authoritative tradition, we don't accompany it with a demonstration that tradition that we so prize leads to genuine human flourishing for everybody. Because surely that's what God wants. Surely that's what the gospel generates. Genuine human flourishing for everybody. So that, in a sense, is the goal of all our pastoral planning and all our talk about tradition and where the church is heading. We as a church have to be those who, in a culture where often there are false forms of human flourishing held out, with all their fake promises, they lead to the exact opposite. In such a moment, we are those who are called by Jesus to stand up and lead by showing that there is a way of true human flourishing for everybody. Now, I'm often asked, in fact, I've got to give a lecture in Melbourne this coming week, about the church, where the church will be in Australia in 20 years' time. And towards the end of the lecture that I've just finished writing, I've said, I don't know. I'm not sure. I know a lot of things. But my crystal ball doesn't give me a very precise picture of where we're going. In that sense, we're all like Abraham, our father in faith. Now, this is important. I talk about this moment in the church as an Abrahamic moment. Now, just focus on Abraham for a moment, because he's in your DNA. He is our father in faith. So there's much more of Abraham and Sarah in you than you think. Abraham was a very successful businessman, and I tell you, Middle Eastern businessmen are tough. They're very hard-nosed and they're very smart. And he was exactly like that. And he was very successful, working the trade routes, the Fertile Crescent, as they call it, of the Middle East, avoiding the desert and going up around the Fertile Crescent. And he made a lot of money. And yet he was still the human being in the shadow of death. Why? Because he didn't have any children and he didn't have a land of his own. He was an itinerant businessman. And in his culture, if you didn't have children and your own land, in the end, death had the last word in your life, because you lived on in your progeny and you lived on in your patrimonial land. So he had everything but nothing in the end. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And then out of the blue, and I really do mean out of the blue, this nameless God just erupts and says to the hard-nosed businessman who knows a deal when he sees it, go, leave everything that you're familiar with, your profession, your financial success, leave all that you know and feel comfortable with and set out on a journey which may seem crazy, and I will give you the things you lack. I will give you children and your own land. I will give you the life that is bigger than death. Now, this is crazy. First of all, God just says, go. He doesn't tap Abraham on the shoulder and say, excuse me, can we talk about a deal? It's just an imperative, go. Without any introduction. In a world of many gods, this God just says, get out of here. And trust me. Sounds like Richard Nixon. Abraham would have loved, I'm sure, to sit down and say, well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the deal. But this is a God who doesn't do deals. Abraham would have loved a map, a road map, or an even better, a GPS. 500 metres, turn right. And then, you see, he could have taken charge, and he was an alpha male. He was used to being in charge, calling the shots and saying where we go. And God says, no, that's not the deal. That's not the game I play. So Abraham has to set out into the unknown, not knowing where he's going, but following the one who's made the crazy promise. You see, the problem with the promise is God says, I'll give you children, more than you can count. But there's one huge physical problem. Sarah's barren. So what's the promise? I will bring the child from the barren womb. What? And then the problem with I'll give you a land of your own, all the land was taken. So that promise seemed as ridiculous as the promise of a child. So the promise of a life that's bigger than death always seems crazy. It defies any logic that we recognise, like Jesus rising from the dead. But the only thing God's good at in the Bible is doing the impossible, like bringing babies from barren wombs and dead men from tombs. Now that's the God in whom we, like Abraham, have put our faith. So I don't know where we're going. All I do know is we can't just appeal mechanically to the patterns and rhythms of the past. We are at a point, as a church in Australia and certainly here in Brisbane, where we have to make big decisions about the future. That's why we're heading for a plenary council. Plenary means the whole church, not just the bishops, everybody. You're as much involved, you mob particularly, because you are leaders in all kinds of ways. It's as much your council as it is mine. And so it's the whole church. Council means it's a decision-making time. It's not just a talk fest or another meeting or conference. We don't need any more of them. But this is decision time. But you see, like Abraham, we can only make our decision if first of all we listen. I said Abraham doesn't have a road map or a GPS. Therefore, the only way he can know where it's all going is if he keeps his eye and ear on the only one who does know where it's going, and that's God. So you see why this is a moment in the church in this country for a new kind of listening. And I do mean primarily, though not exclusively, listening to the voice of God, who does know where we're going. Listening to the voice of the Spirit, who is the voice of God, Father, Son and Spirit. Because only God knows where we're going. If we try and take over, we'll head into disaster. Take it from me. Exactly the same with Abraham. God leads Abraham eventually into some crazy places like a land that has famine. And at that point, Abraham's thinking, this God's led me not up the garden path, but up the desert path. I've been betrayed. It was a bad deal. So what does he decide to do? I'm going to take over. I'm going to go down to Egypt where you can always get a feed. And I'm going to tell the Egyptians that my beautiful wife Sarah is actually my sister. And Pharaoh will take Sarah into his harem. And Pharaoh's very fond of Sarah. And because he's very fond of Sarah, he treats Abraham very well. And Abraham thinks, this is the way to go. I've really scored big time. Pharaoh then discovers that Sarah is Abraham's wife, not sister, and he's furious. And he kicks Sarah out of the harem, gives her back to Abraham, and kicks Abraham out of Egypt. So every time in the story of Abraham, every time he takes over and stops looking at and listening to the God who knows where it's going, things go bad. And that's not once upon a time. I can tell you now, this is the prophet Mark, it will happen if we don't, as a church, a whole church, listen to the voice of the Spirit at this time. Pope Francis, this was an important moment for me personally, and I think for the church in Australia. On the 17th of October 2015, it was the synod, the second synod on the family that I attended. And one Saturday morning, October the 17th, we had a big celebration for the 50 years of the synods of bishops since the Second Vatican Council. Well, we all doled up and we traipsed into the great big audience hall in the Vatican, and all the heavies were sitting up on the stage and the Pope in the middle of them, and it became one of these fantastic Latin talk fests. Speech after speech, some of them okay, some of them shocking. And at the 2-hour mark, we were allowed to get up and stretch our legs before we sat down for the 3rd hour. Now, the Pope eventually stood up right at the end, and we were all starving. We wanted to go to lunch. So we then get this over with. Pope Francis got up and he started speaking in that low voice he can have, rather a dull voice, and he's just thanking everybody, and we're all thinking, oh yeah, the usual stuff, get it over with. But then he got into his stride and he gave a talk about what's called the synodality of the church. In other words, a synodal church, not some of the church some of the time, but all of the church all of the time, on a journey together, like Abraham, on a journey. We haven't got a road map or a GPS, but on a journey together, and that's what the plenary council is all about. Synod means on the road together in Greek. Council is just the Latin word for it. And the first word he used to say what he meant by a synodal church, all of the time, was a listening church. Now here he's going back to the very fountainhead of the biblical tradition, because in a sense the first word in the whole of the Bible is listen. You hear it in the book of Deuteronomy, words that the Jewish people recite every day. Shema Yisrael. From the book of Deuteronomy, listen Israel. The Lord your God is one, and so on. And Jesus takes those words when he's asked which is the first commandment. He says the first commandment is in the book of Deuteronomy, and you know it. Listen. To what? The word of God. All right, what's that mean? God actually communicates. Now, there's a hopeless disproportion in this. Just focus on this for a moment, that the God whom the whole billions of galaxies, the whole cosmos cannot contain, not even the cosmos of the human mind and imagination. This God who is unimaginably, unspeakably big, chooses to communicate with us. It's almost ridiculous, but that's what we say. And what does God do in communicating with us? Again, you go back to the very start of the biblical story. This is your life. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God creates the heavens and the earth. The world was dark and empty and without form, and darkness was on the face of the deep. You know the story. And then we're told, we hear with the breath of God, the ruach, sometimes called the Spirit of God, same word in Hebrew. Ruach means spirit or breath. The breath of God moves in the darkness, is heard in the darkness, moving over the waters of chaos. And then we're told the breath of God hits the divine vocal cords and out comes the single word light, vayihi or, Hebrew, and there was light. So why does God communicate with us? What's the effect of the word God speaks? Answer, light out of darkness. And we're on the road to Easter. Life out of death, order out of chaos, fullness out of emptiness. Take your pick. That's what God is. That's what God does. Just by the way, in that first verse of the Bible, God is introduced really without a name. God is called Elohim. Bereshit bara Elohim, et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. That's the first line. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But Elohim's not a name, and to make things worse, it's in the plural. Whereas there's nothing that the Bible defends so consistently and passionately as the one God. So what's going on? This God says, you want to know my name? Don't ask me my name. You look at what I do. This is a God who names himself in action. Same with us. So naming God is a hugely important task. There's no more task more central to human life than naming God, discovering who God is. But you've got to look at what God does. And what God does is clear from the first page of Scripture. And it's no less clear on the last page, because once God brings light out of darkness, as I say, we're on the way to Jesus rising from the dead. And that's why we make such a fuss about light and darkness at the Easter Vigil. It's the most powerful symbolism to speak the truth that we're trying to proclaim. And it's a truth that goes back to page 1 of the Bible. Listen to that word and allow its power into your life. The word's not empty. It is what they call performative speech. God says light, and there is light. This is a word that does what it says. It performs what it indicates. So listening is all about allowing the power of God into our powerlessness. Or, to use the language of Genesis 1, allowing the light of God into our darkness, the fullness of God into our emptiness, the order of God, the harmonics of paradise into our chaos, our personal chaos and our communal chaos. So that's what's at stake when we talk about listening, and it's what's at stake when we talk about leading. At the very heart of biblical religion, there is the mystery of a liberating obedience. Now, the word obedience simply means to listen to the voice of another in a world where there's lots of pressure saying, listen only to your own voice. See, that's if we don't listen to the voice of another, the only voice we'll ever hear is our own voice. And the whole world becomes a kind of an echo chamber that ends up a kind of tomb. So listen in the way of true obedience, and you will find freedom. Here I think of the most influential text, religious text, that the West has ever produced, the Rule of St. Benedict. Its influence reaches into every corner of church life. Extraordinary how influential a document can be. And again, what's the first word of the Rule of St. Benedict? Ausculta. Listen, my son, my daughter, to the word of the teacher. So, why listen? Because only then will you discover freedom. And this is, again, right at the heart of biblical religion. It's all about freedom, liberation. Are you son, daughter, or are you slave? We heard the gospel of the prodigal son, which takes us to the heart of biblical religion. The Bible begins with Exodus, the liberation of slaves against all the odds. Now, ancient Israel came to ask the question, the Exodus was a great experience for our forefathers and foremothers. When they came out of Egypt, it seemed impossible, absolutely against the odds. Here they were thundering out of Egypt. The Pharaoh changes his mind, he thunders after them. They're caught between the devil and the deep Red Sea, they're gone. What happens? The sea opens. Well, what a surprise. Through they go, and you know the rest of the story. So again, the only thing this God's good at is doing what seems to us impossible. So that was a great experience, that great act of divine liberation way back then. But as time rolled on, as centuries rolled on, the question was, well, what about us in our time? How can we come forth from our Egypt, in the end even the Egypt of death? The answer to it, the very strange and wonderful answer to which the Bible moves is, you can come forth from any Egypt, even the Egypt of death, by way of a liberating obedience. And you see why the New Testament makes such a fuss of Jesus being the obedient one, the one who listened to the voice of God, his Father, Abba. Even in a moment like Gethsemane, when what he heard was shocking. This God, in perfect, infinite love, says to Jesus in the garden, go to that shocking death. No wonder he sweated blood. So there are strangenesses and shocking things that come from the mouth of God. The word of God is not always nice. Again, if you read the prophets, often the language seems violent. I will rip the hell out of you and all that. But what are you listening to? You're listening to what seems to be the violence of the divine love. See, perfect love is total in its demand. It demands everything of the human being. Now, we're not used to that and we're not comfortable with it. We want to give God something, and God says, no, I want everything. And that demand for everything can feel like an attack, an assault on me. It's like that parable that I've often told of the man who decided life was just too hard to bear. So he didn't commit suicide. What he did, he went out and bought a great big corrugated iron tank, and he furnished it with everything he needed. He had a bed to sleep on, books to read, a desk to write, and even a nice crucifix on the wall to help him to pray. And there he lived, safe, as it were, from all the pressures of the world. There was one problem, however. Morning and evening without fail, volleys of bullets would rip through the walls of his tank. He didn't know who the hell was firing the bullets, and all he could do was lie on the floor to stop being shot. Eventually, though, he started to look through the bullet holes and see life outside. Birds flying in the sky, kids with kites, and so on. And eventually there were so many bullet holes that all just rusted and fell to pieces, and he walked out of the tank. And there facing him was the bloke with the gun, the marksman. And the guy who'd come from the tank said, all right, you're going to shoot me. Now, I know. Get it over and done with. But before you kill me, tell me one thing. Why are you my enemy when I've never done you any harm? And the guy with the gun simply put the gun down and smiled at him and said, I'm not your enemy. And the other guy looked at him and he saw there were scars on his hands and his feet. And these scars shone like the sun. See what I mean by violence? Of the perfect love that will get us out of the tank, because that's the tomb. That's the pigsty or the forest in the terms that I was proposing at Mass. To obey this strange speaking God is to recognise that I'm not God. See, that's the root sin of the human family. Call it original sin if you like. But again, you go back to Genesis 3, the story of the fall, which is our story. Why does the human being reach up for the glittering fruit of the forbidden tree? Because she or he wants to be God. The serpent says, God knows that when you eat the fruit you will be like God, knowing good and evil, deciding for yourself what is good, what is evil. You too can be God. So that when we reach up for the fruit, we're trying to be God. And those who try to be God end up slaves, and those who try to be God end up hearing only their own voice in an echo chamber that becomes a tomb. The scripture also says that the capacity to listen to God is tied totally to the capacity to listen to each other. And that's part of the new listening to which we are called. The French have a very beautiful image of the Annunciation of Our Lady. And it's called in French Notre-Dame de l'Écoute, Our Lady of the Listening. And she's depicted, as it were, with her ear open to the angel. She doesn't look at the angel, interestingly. She simply listens to the word that she speaks. And the understanding of this image of Notre-Dame de l'Écoute is that she listens to us perfectly because she listens to God perfectly. So you see it in Mary, what I'm talking about. You can't speak of the listening to God without listening to other people. And how hard we find that. Usually we're preparing our next bit, not really listening to what the other person is saying, but preparing our own reply. We can be so full of our own words. There is no space, no capacity to listen to the voice of the other. A listening to others at this time in the church will have to be a listening to their story. Even if we find the story unsettling or marked by sin, to listen to their story and to be asking the question as we listen, humbly, God knows that word's important, humility. I'll come back to that in a moment. But to listen humbly and respectfully to the truth. What is the truth of their experience? There is some truth in it. And this is one of the things that the Holy Father, I think, is saying about those who have found themselves divorced and remarried. Don't just throw stones at them, is the expression he uses. And you could name any other number of groups. You know, he says, we don't just turn the truth of our faith into rocks that we're hurling at people like that adulterous woman in John's Gospel, chapter 8. But what's the truth of their experience? What is their deeper story? And we're not always good at that, but the leader who doesn't do that and yet who claims to be listening to the voice of God, it doesn't really convince. Those who really listen to the voice of God, and by the way, that's where Christian prayer begins. Christian prayer is distinctive because it begins with a listening to God, not a speaking. You only speak once you've listened in response to what you've heard. Now, similarly, with people, you listen to them And I mean, I say this to myself, first of all, because I'm essentially a speaker, as you're hearing. It can be hard to listen when you're trained as a speaker and you have that gift. It can be very hard to listen, to make room for the other, and not to be jumping, saying, yes, I know, oh, yes, I know the answer to that one. But to stand back and shut up, as it were, to listen, to learn in a new way the art of silence, but a silence that's not empty. And just listen to the story, however uncomfortable it makes us, listen to it. And I tell you, my most powerful and difficult experience of this has been listening to the victims and survivors of sexual abuse. It has been one of the most life-changing experiences that I've known. But until you've sat across a table or wherever and listened to their story and really listened, you don't know what you're talking about. And some people who pontificate about sexual abuse and the church's response, I don't think they've ever listened to a victim or survivor. I didn't until I actually did listen. It goes back a while now. And I still do it. And you never get used to it. It's never comfortable. It is seriously unsettling. But until you do it, there is no way that you will do what we're called to do, and that is to see with the eye of the victim and to hear with the ear of the victim. That's extremely difficult. But if we don't do it, then we're not seeing with the eye of the crucified and we're not hearing with the ear of the crucified. So, how are we at this time, we who are called to be leaders, all of us, to move beyond what the Pope has called mere administration? A phrase he uses in that remarkable letter that he wrote to us all called The Joy of the Gospel. If you haven't read it, read it. If you have read it, you might want to read parts of it again. See, the danger is, particularly for bishops, I have to say, that you slip into a managerial mode. I am not a manager. There are managerial aspects of my work, my ministry, but I'm not a manager. But by heck, you can slip into that mode. So how are we going to not slip into the mode, move beyond mere administration? Listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Set out on a journey of discernment. Has become an important word since we've had a Jesuit Pope. St. Ignatius Loyola wasn't the first to talk about discernment of spirits. It goes back into the New Testament. But there's no question that St. Ignatius Loyola reflected more profoundly and systematically upon discernment of spirits than anyone before him had really done. What he says is that discernment is a subtle business, a messy business, because the spirit of evil can appear as an angel of light. And that's true in my experience. So trying to discern between the spirit of evil and the angel of light can take time and be a subtle and messy business. Eventually, Ignatius says that you know when the angel of light, the good spirit, the Spirit of God, is moving you because you experience a deep-seated peace, even though what you hear might be disconcerting, profoundly disconcerting, just as Abraham hears that disconcerting word. But however disconcerting it is, there is some sense, deep sense, unshakable sense of peace. You know that the spirit of evil is moving if you have, however sensible it might seem and however seductive it might seem, because again, evil is always seductive. However seductive it might seem, there is a sense of disruption, desolation, the opposite of peace, disquiet. So he says that the criterion is not that hard to know. Now, I have to say that synod that I attended, back in 2015 was a most powerful experience of the process of discernment for me. I went to a Jesuit-run seminary, and I was taught by the Jesuits at the Biblical Institute in Rome for my higher studies. So there's a lot of SJ in me, I've got to say, for better or worse. But I don't remember a more powerful experience of the discernment of what the Spirit is saying than that synod. Because I tell you now, we set off, it was a 3-week process, and halfway through, I thought, this is going nowhere. It was all over the place. And I couldn't see how in 10 days' time we were going to produce anything that was worth producing. And it was tempting to lose the nerve, believe me, and to say, this is bad news. This is out of control. This is going nowhere. It's like, people say, oh, Pope Francis is leading the church into bedlam or chaos. Well, hang on. That was the feeling during that synod. 10 days later, we in fact did produce something that was thoroughly, it wasn't the last word, but I tell you now, we voted on 94 paragraphs of the final document, every one of them, pressing your button. And when the last vote was taken on the 94th paragraph and the votes went up again, it got the required 2/3 majority, everyone in that hall stood up and clapped, even the Pope. And part of the applause was because we didn't see it happening like this. It didn't look possible 10 days earlier. It was the most extraordinary moment. And it's not the protocol in that setting, believe me. But it was a recognition that the Spirit had somehow moved through all the mess and taken us to a point which was not a point of arrival, but it was a point of achievement. Now that's where we are as a church. And I finish with this again with the plenary council. It's that same kind of process of discernment, and it will be messy. There will be times when it feels as if it's going all over the place, going nowhere, it's a waste of time, it's bedlam, it's chaos, and there will be people saying, wrong way, go back. And the challenge for all of us will have to be, I think, that we not lose our nerve. Don't take over the way Abraham did, because that's when things will go bad. But keep our eye on the one who knows where we're going, who has called us, and keep our ear on the one who does communicate and who will lead us probably to places we don't expect. Those words of Jesus to Peter at the end of John's Gospel. When you were young, you put on your own belt and you went where you liked. But when you grow old, someone else will put a belt around you and take you where you would rather not go. And John adds, with these words, he indicated the kind of death by which Peter would give glory to God, the martyrdom. So look, as a church, we may be led into places we don't foresee and places that we may not choose, perhaps where we would rather not go. But the call, the challenge is surely to trust the one who has called us on the journey. This wasn't our call. We are being called. But only those who are able to be led really can be led. And that's the call that comes to us, all of us here in this diocese and in this country, all of us who are the sons and daughters of Abraham. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be here, and thank you, Archbishop Mark, for setting the scene. This session will probably be a little different in the sense that it'll be more process-focused. I will be giving a few little things I've learned in my life, but I'll be also inviting you to share your experiences with one another at the table. So, as Archbishop Mark said, listening is going to be a very important skill as we learn to become missionary disciples together. I love that phrase of Pope Francis's, being missionary disciples. And how do we do that together? And as you are aware, the Plenary Council of 2020 is on the horizon, and Pope Francis is committed to this kind of church, the synodal church. And he says to us, a synodal church is a church that listens, which realises that listening is more than simply hearing. Now, so often we're listening to somebody and we're thinking about, how can we tell our story? Where will I jump in here? That's not my thoughts. But he's saying it's listening is something more. It's a mutual listening in which everyone has something new to learn. The faithful people, and I love that he starts there, the College of Bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all listening to each other and all listening to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, in order to know what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And I think Archbishop Mark gave us a couple of wonderful examples there this morning. His own experience of being in Rome for the Synod of the Family, and I too, like him, it has been such a big journey listening to the survivors of sexual abuse. And I have learnt so much, and I've also learnt how to be with someone and not to have to say anything. And I guess we see this kind of listening alive in the Council of Jerusalem. And that story is told back in the Acts of the Apostles. And remember that story? Paul and Barnabas come to the council and say, look, there's a big problem. We've got all these people who believe in Jesus, they want to follow his way, but you're saying they've got to be circumcised. And they have this conversation. They share their experiences. And what happens? The council is able to make a shift. And they decide, no, the Gentiles don't need to be circumcised to be Christians. And not only that, at the end of the council they said, we will send 2 members from this council with you as you share this news with the community. This is the kind of church I think we're being called to be, and I call it the middle space. It's the in-between. It's the Holy Saturday space. We don't know where it's leading us, but we know it's of the Spirit. I think our Indigenous brothers and sisters have something to teach us here as well. And there's this lovely reflection, or the word dadiri, which means inner, deep listening and quiet, still awareness. Something that what we speak comes from the inner place. We listen from the inner place. And it's interesting that Archbishop spoke about the rule of Benedict. And we have that lovely saying, don't we, of Benedict? Listen with the ears of your heart. That's challenging. It's a process of deep and respectful listening to build community. And that's what we're on about today. It's been part of our community life as we gather in small groups. And particularly I reflect that the nature of the Lenten programs in this archdiocese has changed over time. if you're engaged in the Lenten programs, you probably notice that they are a lot more reflective. For me, I guess this understanding came when I first began with school boards. And we had a visit from a Benedictine, interestingly, Sister Mary Bennett McKenney, and she came here and she shared her shared wisdom model. And I know that that model has been in the Parish Pastoral Council handbooks. That wonderful piece of wisdom, whenever 2 or 3 come together, I'm with you, and the Spirit will always be with you. And the key principles, everyone is given a piece of the wisdom. Everyone. No one has all the wisdom. I think that's what Pope Francis is saying. Different people bring different pieces of the wisdom to the group. And our responsibility is to share that piece of wisdom. Now, just a little experience from my own life. When I began in leadership in 2014, congregational leadership, one of the things that was on the agenda was to look at the future of our incorporated ministries. And we had a board formation day, and I probably had a vision about where I thought it might be going to need to go. And we had an afternoon panel. And at the panel, one person brought a piece of wisdom to the discussion, which was, we have too many boards here, we have a whole lot of little ministries, perhaps we need to be doing more things together. What's going to give life to all these wonderful works? What will give them the best opportunity? And it changed the whole direction of where we were heading. Now that journey has taken us 4 years to come to where we are today. So I'm just going to invite you now. You listened this morning, and just in twos, because I think there are 6 at most tables, you might share what's one piece of wisdom that you heard, and see if you can really listen to the other. So, what was a piece of wisdom you heard in the first session today that you want to hold on to? So just take a moment's silence to get in touch with that. You don't need to go back over your notes. Something's probably stayed with you. What was that like for you? Mary Bennett McKenney says, to share wisdom effectively, each person in the group is called to share their wisdom. So did each person have an opportunity to share? Did you think that you were listened to with respect? Was it valued what you had to say? Were you taken into something that you hadn't thought about or reflected? And I guess it was quite interesting to note that people heard different things. And why is that? Because we all bring our own story, don't we? We all bring our own experience. We all bring our own engagement. And so something in that talk this morning probably touched you, and something else touched someone else. So here's just a few little reflections about what's it like to do some good listening. Doesn't want to go. Sorry. So good listening requires patience. Am I truly able to listen to another, or am I simply waiting to get my chance to speak? Now, I know myself, often I'm listening to get my point in, you know? I'm not really listening to the person or the story or the wisdom or the experience of that person. Have you ever found yourself turning off? Saying, oh no, here they are again. Good listening requires attentiveness and patience. To really listen to another is really an act of love. Being truly present to another, believing that that person is the beat of the sacred. And it empowers and it values the other person. When you're not listened to, what happens? Often you can feel diminished, can't you? It also asks, It also asks us to ask questions, perceptive questions, not just questions to, get a little bit more detail, but a good listening often takes the conversation deeper. What do you mean by that? Can you help me to understand a little more? I wonder if that happens in your parish pastoral council or your pastoral teams. I heard you saying this. Can you help me to understand it? It's actually ministry. Good listening is ministry. It's actually being willing to listen with compassion, to be truly present to another. Have you ever had that experience of someone listening to you and you really felt they were with you? They were listening, they were nodding, they were umming, yeah. And it took you somewhere. I often find that on retreats. I get taken to places. Someone listens and I get taken to places I had no idea I was going to go to. And it also reflects our relationship with God. So if I keep filling my life up with chatter, I'm probably doing that with God as well. And I think one of the really important things about listening for the future is going to be having these pauses of silence, tuning down, going down a little. What's happening for me as I listen? And if I listen well, then my response will come from a different place. So if I'm going to share something, my response will come from a different place. So we're just going to take another little moment, a reflective pause, and reflect on a time when someone gave you the gift of listening, when you experienced the gift of listening from another. Just to concentrate on that for a moment. When's a time when you felt really listened to? And then just shift into your parish experience. When has good listening brought about a positive outcome for you and for your parish community? Can you think of a time when that happened? And here's an opportunity. Just focus on this, particularly the second part there. Can you think of an experience in your parish community where good listening brought about a positive outcome? So have a conversation at your table. I wonder if there might be 2 or 3 people who, in your listening, have heard an experience where good listening has brought about a positive outcome in a parish. So we've got 2 or 3 brave people who might be willing to share. It could be something you heard, you listened to at your table. It doesn't have to be your own story. So what I'm hearing as you share those stories, and I know there are a lot more of those stories in this room, is I feel empowered. I feel empowered by your sharings, and others feel empowered by it as well. And that's true. I was just, when someone reflected, putting up, and you acted, you got into the action. I've been on committees where we've gathered all this information and we've delivered it to where we had to deliver it, and it's probably ended up on the shelf, gathering dust, or maybe even in the rubbish bin. So what does that do to you? It actually diminishes you, doesn't it? So good listening uplifts, empowers, and not good listening diminishes and takes away your energy. So important that, we actually can listen to the heart of another. So what I was hearing were some of these things that I wanted to share with you. Giving the gift of listening. Giving the gift of listening starts with you setting aside for the moment your agenda to be sourced in a conversation with another. Now, how many times have you been to a meeting today? People arrive with their mobile phone. They put the mobile phone on the table in front of you. They may have it turned to silent, but you know that they're waiting. Or have you noticed even at morning tea? People, as soon as the break comes, people are out running on their mobile phone.
See if they won the lotto.
See if they won the lotto. Now, there are times when you do need to do that. You may have someone sick in hospital and you need to be attentive to it. I'm not saying yay or nay about it. I'm just saying, to be mindful of, is this me not really giving myself to this experience? And we're in a different world, and I'm still learning this world of technology and how it impacts. Giving the gift of listening invites listening with your body, your heart, and your intuition. So, sometimes somebody leans forward. Somebody holds your eyes. But if somebody goes back like this, or pushes their chair back, do you want to keep telling your story? Probably not. Giving the gift of listening requires one to be aware of the filters we bring with us. That can be any kind of a filter, So it can be the filter, I'm going to that meeting tonight and I know so-and-so is going to be there and she drives me mad. And, or this person is from this culture and I find it really hard to listen to that kind of a culture. Now, we had a little experience of this the other day ourselves. We're actually trying to discern around a ministry that we have that's held within a certain property, and we're engaging with different groups around it. And one of the things for me naturally was to one group that wanted to converse with us. I don't really want to be conversing with that group. And you know what? When we heard them, I was excited about it. Now, we haven't finished that yet, but it just shows if you can leave your filters at the door, good things can happen. It also requires us to use appropriate questions, and I think I said that. Questions for clarification or that take the conversation deeper. And good listening honours another person. And I just thought a good example of this is the Syrophoenician woman, isn't it? Doesn't want to come. Look at the question. Let's look at It's an experience for both Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman. The Syrophoenician woman comes with a story. Jesus and the apostles come with a filter. The filter is, I've come just for the lost sheep of Israel. She says to Jesus, "Can you cure my daughter?" Now listen to Jesus' response. "I didn't come for you." Now at that stage, the person could have got completely diminished and left. But the need in her was so strong that she came back with another response. And in that response, it shifts Jesus' thinking. Can you see that? He cures her. He says, "Go home, your faith is great." So asking the right question, leaving behind our filters, gives the space for growth and transformation to happen. That's what our hope for this church that we are in the middle space, in the chaos. It's about, can it take us to the place of transformation? Now, I just want to say a little bit about how might we grow in our capacity as leaders to listen. And it requires two things: being attentive to the other and being attentive to the voice of God in it. So at the practical level, and you do this in your workplaces, this is not just a church thing, but you might set some ground rules, or perhaps you might want to call it a covenant. If a person in the group, for example, is speaking, no one should interrupt. Now, of course, that gets tricky when you get somebody who can't stop, doesn't it? How do you bring that to a conclusion? How do you say, well, your story is really, really important, but we are time bound, aren't we, as well? At our meetings, we will turn our mobile phones to silence and perhaps put them in a place that won't distract the whole group. We all commit ourselves to bringing our piece of the wisdom. You know, you might have a detail that nobody else has thought about, and you can sit on it. And your parish may be the poorer for it. Oh, sorry. I'll just come back to that. Listening to God. Listening to the voice of God in the midst of all of this. What's the invitation? Well, I think the scriptures again give us some clues, don't they? We have Mary, the Annunciation was spoken about this morning. Mary listens to the voice of God through the questions. How can this be? We get the same in Jeremiah. I'm too young. I can't do this. In Joseph, we get Joseph hearing the voice of God in his dreams, in the dreams for our parish. In Elijah, we get people hearing the voice of God through the gift of nature. Have you ever been somewhere where you're thinking about something and the penny drops and, you got the insight? I don't know, do any of you look at Death in Paradise on Saturday night? It's a bit like the detective, isn't it? You know, he gets this, it's sort of here, and then somebody says something and he gets a hunch and And it's the clue. Myself, I sort of know when my stomach churning, or do I feel like I can go and have a banquet? That's always a good indicator for me. So many people today, I've got those there, sorry, are talking about contemplative dialogue. Now, many of you are into centering prayer and Lectio Divino and all those things that you do. So does this mean I just go away and sit in a quiet corner? Well, look at what comes afterwards. It's contemplative dialogue. It's a way of engaging in a meaningful conversation that is rooted in deep listening. And I think the Archbishop this morning spoke about that. For me, a wonderful example of that was how the religious women leaders of America, when they had to engage with the Vatican through an investigation, how they dialogued around the issue. And I remember meeting one of those sisters, and she said, before we went to meet with the Council for the Doctrine of Faith, we sat together in silence in contemplative prayer. And the outcome was quite different, and I think it was a wonderful example of that. I think Mary MacKillop's another example of that. Someone who was at odds but never put people down at times and was able to see through, go to another space, go through to that. So what does it look like? Well, these are some of the things it looks like. We listen deeply for the emergence of fresh wisdom, and we heard that in those stories. We risk being changed by the perspective of the other. It's a way of holding and being willing to be there in paradox with others. Others whom you might necessarily agree with. And it's listening, it's about honouring the person. Now, I'm just going to skip a little, and these are all lovely. That's a lovely thing, a reflection from Joan Chittiser. She says, in the Benedictine tradition, they have this value of hospitality, and they invite guests into their place. And she said, reflecting on it, it says, thank God that someone has come to stretch our minds and our souls. So every time someone new comes into your parish or a new member becomes part of your team, thank God. They're going to stretch your mind and your soul. Thank God someone's come to shake us from our complacency, the little voice of the Filipino. Someone has come to prod us beyond ourselves. So good listening does that. So I can go. Sorry. So I just want to walk you through this little simple process, because in a moment we're going to engage in a conversation at your table, and my people could go around and do that while I do this. This is something I've found helpful when I've been working with groups. Firstly, to find someone in the group who will be the holder of the group. Now, often this would be your chairperson of your parish pastoral council. It may be a team member, but you need to have somebody who's going to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to be heard. Then for you to consider the topic, and on your table you'll find a little scenario, and just before you begin a conversation about it, find your own place. Take a little bit of silence. What response do I want to make? This is what you do when you prepare to get ready for a meeting, isn't it? You're getting your thoughts and reflections together. And what's guiding your response? That's the first thing. So take a little bit of silence, and then when you're ready, the holder of the group or the coordinator, the leader, whatever you want to call them, invites people to start to share their reflection or their insight. And what I'm asked to do is to listen. Not to listen to think about, well, how am I going to respond to that person? It's about listening and seeing what's going on inside me as I listen. You may want to ask something for clarity to help you to understand more, but don't get into that discussion till everybody's had a chance to respond. Because often that happens, isn't it? One person makes a comment, everybody in the group then responds to that person, and then somebody else's piece of wisdom has never come to the table. So give everyone the opportunity to speak first before we get into clarifying and discussing. In some groups, I'm not suggesting we do this today, but some people have something like a message stick or a candle just to help people to stay focused. Now, this initial response to the scenario is not a dissertation. It's not a PhD thesis. It's just your own personal response. And then when you've listened to everyone, what did I hear the group saying about this reality? Now, in the bigger scene, you might want to add you might need some other wisdom. You know, you might need some wisdom from the tradition of the church. You might need some wisdom from the scriptures. You might need some wisdom, from a book you've read or something. We won't do that today because, we're just going to respond to that. And then to see, what do you think was the invitation of God to you as you discuss this scenario? So now I'm going to invite you. There's a scenario on your table, but firstly, decide who's going to be the holder of the group. Take some silence to see how am I going to respond to this challenge. And then when you've done that, the holder of the group may invite people to share their piece of the wisdom. You don't have to go around the table one by one. And always, in good listening, somebody today may not be feeling very well. They might have a sick relative. They always have a freedom to say, today I don't have a response to that. Okay, you always need to give people that kind of freedom. It's not that they're not interested, it's just the circumstances of their life. So off you go. Okay. Now I know you haven't finished, and I'm not going to find out, did you resolve the scenario? Because the exercise is more about how did we go in the process? How did we go at this simple form of contemplative dialogue? So, did we take a moment to actually sit with how you were going to respond to the topic? Did every person have an opportunity to share a piece of wisdom? Did I notice what was happening in myself as I listened to others? Did you have a sense of where the group was? Now, I know you didn't finish all the conversation, but did you have a sense of where the group was? And maybe some of you got to a place of, what was your sense of God's invitation? So what we want to hear from you, from your table, is how was the experience? What did you learn? Were you able to stay with it, or did you go off on another topic? What was the experience? What was the learning for you? What didn't work for you? So you might like to have a little conversation about that, and then we'll get some feedback from each of you, each table, all right? How was the experience? What am I learning? Okay. And just another little reflection. Looking at these 4 principles which are essential to this experience of contemplative dialogue, did you feel honoured and valued by the members of the group? Where did you hear the emergence of the new? Was there any fresh wisdom that someone offered? When did you risk being changed by the perspective of another? Did any of that happen in your group? And were there moments of difference? And how did you manage those? So have a little natter about that, and then we'll get some feedback. So, did you feel honoured? Was there any fresh wisdom? Were you changed by the perspective of another? How did you manage the differences? Thank you for that, and thank you for the learnings that you have shared with one another. I do realise, of course, a scenario, it's sometimes much more difficult when you're faced with the reality that it's your little community. But one of the comments made was it was not the end result. It wasn't the solution that mattered. It was the process of how you got there. And I think that's going to be really, really important as we engage with the Plenary Council. It's not so much about the outcome. The outcomes will be important, but I think it's going to be around what happens on the journey to that final time that will be important. And can we do that in a way where we can hear or be present with others? And that was really what I was hoping to bring out of today. Would have loved to have heard how you resolved all your scenarios, but that's fine. Just to say, in your folder, if you haven't already discovered it, there is a couple of pages, and that little process is on the back of that. I will leave my PowerPoint and script to go on the point. So thank you. It's been lovely to connect. Wonderful to hear the wisdom in the room, and so lovely to hear that it's been an experience where there's been mutual listening and sharing and empowering of each other. So thank you.